dissecting the American dream. So, in other words, what we're going to do in this module is to take a critical look at post-war American society, its ideology for the good life, its consumer economy. Did this society measure up in terms of delivering what it promised? In other words, the basic idea of the American dream as it emerged during a period of unprecedented prosperity was that if you just let the economy do its thing and consumer corporations produce these various goods and you had the credit to access them, you would be materially prosperous, you would be happy, you would be living the good life. This was the ideal perspective that was sold in magazines and advertisements. This was the image that was projected out by the United States during the Cold War in its competition with the Soviet Union. It was presenting a view of a better life as distinct from the material security provided by the Soviet bloc system. Now, in order to engage in that critical analysis, to have a focal point and able to analyze it and to measure its success in delivering on its promise, we're going to look at Levittown. Levittown was, in a way, the original automobile suburb. Now, there have been suburbs before. Suburbs are very old. In terms of industrial cities, the first suburbs had really emerged relative to communities that were built outside the city centers and connected through tramways. So Levittown was really the first automobile suburb. In other words, people that lived far away from Manhattan, in this case Long Island, were able to commute to work thanks to the availability of automobiles, thanks to subsidies that enabled these communities to be built on farmland, and also thanks to federal investment that made it possible to build these roadways that enabled people to separate their family life, their social life, their domestic experience from the city and their working lives. Now, one of the really unheralded heroes of the 20th century was a man by the name of William Levitt, although he also had his brother, Arthur Levitt. It was a family business. They were a Jewish family, real estate developers. And, the big need for American society in 1945 was for affordable housing. And what William Levitt was able to do was not only figure out a formula for affordable housing, but to create a suburban blueprint for this that was wildly popular. In fact, it was so popular, it was copied in cities throughout the United States. So what we're going to do is to look at Levittown, some of its design characteristics, the type of communities it created, and then also some of its shortcomings. So, Levittown was the original automobile suburb. And one of the things that was innovative about this type of community was Levitt's application of the mass production model to the construction of housing. Now, traditionally, housing was a very complicated task. You would have a contractor and then various skilled artisans, perhaps carpenters to do the framing, a plumber, electrician, roofer, etc. So constructing a home was a very individualized enterprise. You began with an architect and a blueprint, and then the general contractor would hire all these specialists that would do part of the house. So one of the ways to lower the price for building a house was to apply the mass production model. And this is essentially what William Levitt did for the first time in a relatively innovative way. It was sometimes called the horizontal assembly line, in the sense that once the concrete slab was laid on a block, the framers would come through, and they would go through and do 5 or 6 houses in a day, and then the wood panelists would come in and lay the panels on the houses, and the roofers would come in, and they would do this. Of course, this meant that every house was exactly the same. So this is essentially the Levitt house. It's what was sometimes called a Cape Cod cottage. It was a very simple dwelling. Certainly this, dwelling would not be something which would appeal to most Canadian or American consumers today. It would be far too modest for that. But it was something which could be mass produced. If you had pre-cut lumber, it could be brought from the lumber yard and dropped on the lot. Once a concrete slab was laid, one after the other, all the same size, the framers could come in. Now, this meant that the uniformity design was 100%. We're not just talking that the front door was in the same way, that the house was arranged the same way. I mean, to the smallest detail, like even where the toilet paper roll was in the bathroom was always in the same place. So people that grew up in Levittown homes, they would instinctively reach to their right to grab a toilet paper, even if they now moved to a new house and it was someplace else. It had been that ingrained in that way. Now, by doing this system, Levitt was able to not only build up these homes very rapidly, but to lower the price to essentially a range that the average GI and his family could afford it with a federal-backed mortgage. Now, it wasn't just building this bungalow that was important. The other thing that Arthur and William Levitt came up with was creating the type of community that American GIs wanted. Now, they wanted to be in the countryside, so that was the first element. They bought Farmers Field and converted to housing. But they also knew that their consumers wanted to have a sense of being away from the congestion of the city. So they would build these winding lanes like you were going through some farm field, and they often branded the streets, for example, invoking these images of nature. So Eden Trails or Fox Trail Run. Now, in fact, the nature that was there was completely fake. All the native ecology was destroyed in the process of construction. Topsoil was brought in, and then Kentucky bluegrass was built in. It was, in a way, completely conformist. But nonetheless, this provided exactly what GIs were looking for: a pad of their own, a detached home. They could be master of the realm. They could settle down. Their wife could stay in the kitchen, cook their meals, and when you came home from work in the car, she could run out and bring you your slippers so you could walk in and plop down on the lazy boy and turn on that TV and just detach from the world. So Levittown was very successful because it provided not only an economic formula to meet the need for affordable housing, it was also creating the type of community that so many Americans, particularly GIs, were looking for in the immediate post-war period. Now, the success of these automobile suburbs, and Levittown was the first one, 1947 to 1949. They went through and just built it, street by street over a 2-year period, and then all the land was used up, and you had a village that, literally in 1947 was just fields. By 1949, there was 30,000 homes there, and they were all occupied, almost all of them GIs, white GIs. Almost all the GIs were married, and most of them had young children. And this model was so popular and so profitable that it was copied again and again all across the United States and Canada. Now, there were, of course, a few alterations on the theme, and eventually, as America became more prosperous, people demanded to have, some different homes or larger homes, certainly larger TV screens. But if you look at this, what you see is that the automobile suburb, Levittown as its model, was extremely popular. There was a massive migration wave from inner cities where people had lived and worked to people moving to the suburbs. And the suburb became the prototype for post-war American society, the American dream. Now, there were two technological components that were absolutely critical to suburban post-war life. The first was, of course, the automobile. And the automobile was, of course, what you needed to get between the city where you worked and the home which you lived, which was now divorced from each other. Without the automobile and roads, obviously, it wouldn't be easy. And one of the problems would eventually be that so many people moved to the suburbs that in places like Manhattan, you got stuck. You paid a big price because of these massive traffic jams. As so many people moved to the suburbs and tried to clog these bridges and these choke points, they would spend hours in the car in LA, in the 1990s, and you're living in the desert. It could be a 3 or 4 hour commute. Horrible. The other critical ingredient in the suburb was the television. Because as I mentioned before, the people that are moving to the suburbs were coming from various ethnic communities. You could be Pole, it could be Jewish, it could be Greek, it could be Dutch, it could be German. You had nothing really in common. So these were, in a way, very artificial communities. You had no fundamental connection to your neighbor. You didn't go to school with them. You didn't go to church with them. So what brought them together? Well, television was a very important medium in terms of selling the American dream or the American lifestyle. It was a consumerism that was open to all ethnic groups, except, as we'll see, African Americans and visible minorities. But they were invited to participate in American prosperity, to be patriotic by buying the latest Ford and Chevy, the latest household good, blenders, all these new kitchen appliances that were invented. And in this way, in this prosperity, these luxuries, they were enjoying the good life. And whether you're looking at television or automobiles, what you see is this dramatic increases in sales. That these were really the foundation stocks, the building blocks of the post-war suburb up until roughly 1970. Now I have a chart here as well. One of the things to keep in mind, just looking forward, is the American dream was in a way extraordinary manifestation of a particular period of American prosperity where America was very hegemonic. But what we see is that this dream, this consumerist, materialist society has cross-cultural appeal. And if you go to cities in China and India, for example, obviously they're not the same as Levittown, but you see, again, people are aspiring to buy their apartment, to have cars, to buy consumer goods, have access to them, buying them through credit. These were ideas as inheritance of the American dream as it emerged first in post-war American society. Now, if you were to watch television, and you can still watch old episodes of Leave It to Beaver or Ozzie Harriet Family, I mean, the image that's projected through the television screen is that, American society is great. Everyone is happy living in these type of communities. But, just to show you that there might be a gap between image versus reality, this was also the golden age for psychiatry. And you could say, okay, well, this is a reflection of modern science and, advances and understanding the human mind and, dealing with various anxieties. You could also argue from a demand-based side that, maybe people in medieval Europe or rural Nicaragua don't need psychiatrists because they're pretty well adjusted. They don't have spiritual angst or anxiety or depression. Now, just using that as a forward, one of the things we need to say is if you look at the suburb demographically from a sociological lens, these were multi-ethnic communities. They were white, but they were multiple ethnic groups. And people were leaving their old neighborhood where they'd often lived very closely together. So if you go to Grand Rapids, Michigan, there was the Dutch neighborhood, there was a Polish neighborhood. And these various ethnic communities would live close together because they would walk to church and the bakery and the local restaurant, the local laundry. These were community institutions. So even though it was a city, you belonged to a community within the city. This was your anchor community. When you emigrated from abroad, you would arrive there, and your countrymen would help you to adjust, help you to get your first job, etc. But with suburbanization and this desire to escape the congested, rundown city, what you see is that people move to these suburban communities with new neighbors, people they never knew before. So what was the thing that was in common? Well, what television was projecting is that you were all American, and America was, obviously the best country in the world. And look how prosperous we are. Look at these wonderful gadgets that, industry is coming up with. With advances in science, there's no limits to how happy we can be. But right away, we need to understand that this massive migration to the suburbs was not only about trying to aspire for a better life. There was also a darker side to the American dream. That is, this was white flight. It was white flight, and what we mean by this is that many people that were moving to the suburbs were not just pursuing a better future, they were afraid, paranoid of living in a multi-ethnic, multiracial city. They were fleeing the inner city. The language that was used, and my grandpa used this language as well, and this is the way they talked about it, is if an African American came to your block, it was an indication that your neighborhood had run down, and that the myth was property prices would plummet and everyone would try to escape into the suburbs. So, one of the tactics that, very cunning real estate agents would do is they would use a tactic called blockbusting. They would go to a white neighborhood, they would buy a house that was for sale, and then they would intentionally put an African American family there. The immediate result within a week is that all the white families would come to the determination, it's a little bit of an exaggeration, that the neighborhood had run down, they put their houses for sale, it would cause the property prices to plummet, the real estate agent would go in and buy those up, and then they would flip them to African American families who didn't have access to housing because of discrimination. So this enabled, in other words, the real estate agent to make a killing because they could buy inner city houses cheap, they could flip them to a high price, and if they were lucky, they could also sell a house in the suburb. Now, the reason this was so profitable is because the mortgage industry, the housing society, the job market were all very color coding. American cities became very segregated because of the way that the financing industry discriminated on the basis of race. So you've maybe heard of the idea of redlining. So what redlining essentially meant is that commercial banks, where you needed to turn if you were going to buy a house, because hardly anyone could buy a house just on cash, especially after World War II, you had to get a mortgage or borrow money from a bank. But when you borrow money from a bank, the bank is going to set terms, and one of the terms that they set was that they would only give loans to African Americans in black neighborhoods, or what they defined as black neighborhoods. So in other words, there was an actual red line on the map in places like Detroit, if you think about 10 Mile, and on one side of 10 Mile, they would give a mortgage to an African American family. They would not provide any financing if that African American, doesn't matter where the creditworthiness was, if they tried to buy a house on the other side of the line. So in this way, by creating this system, they segregated American cities according to race. Now, by and large, this segregation hasn't gone away. I mean, it's now illegal to redline, but that doesn't mean there's not discrimination either in the job market or the housing market. In fact, in a way, the segregation's become more intricate because it's more class-based as well. If you're going to buy a house, one of the first things a real estate agent's going to ask you is, what are you looking to spend? And if you're looking to spend $200,000 or $300,000 or $255,000, they're going to take you probably to different neighborhoods. So when you think about suburban developments, they tend to be very class segregated. That everyone that lives in an area is not only usually people of the same race, but also people now of the same income bracket. Now, you might be familiar with the term structural racism. Racism is pretty easy to understand. It's a type of prejudice that, based on someone's skin color, you would imagine that they have certain social, cultural, or intellectual characteristics. What structural racism refers to is essentially how power works in society, and the segregation of American cities is a great exemplar of structural racism. Because what we see is that the prejudices that people had was manifested in the economy, in the mortgage industry, in the real estate industry, so that African Americans could not live in white suburbs or white neighborhoods inside the inner city. So to create this racial segregation, there had to be structures of power. So redlining was one, blockbusting was a tactic that was affiliated with that. There were other mechanisms as well. For instance, on property deeds, on the very deed it would write not for coloreds or for whites only, which meant that in a legal sense, an African American couldn't buy your home. It was invalidated by the law. So there were these informal practices and mechanics in the housing industry that prevented African Americans from going into the suburbs and trap them into the inner city. Into an inner city which was obviously deprived of resources, public transportation, and as a result of being disprivileged, it would, in a sense, go downhill over time. More and more people were buying expensive homes because they were overpriced, because they didn't have access to the full market. They wouldn't be able to afford to keep their homes up. The homes would run down. The consumers wouldn't have money, so the shops would move out. There'd be no jobs. There would be less money for schools. So this is a vicious cycle that essentially created what we commonly call the ghetto, which is an area of the city that is relatively underprivileged. The cost of living might actually be higher than in the white suburb, but certainly the access to services, urban services, is less. Now, another thing to remember about the suburb and how it may not have been a happy community is to think about the history of rock and roll. Where did this come from? Why was rock and roll so popular? Well, it emerged in part as a rejection or what we sometimes call the counterculture revolution, the children who grew up in places like Levittown rejected the materialism, the conformity, the racism, the unecological nature of the communities in which they had been born and raised. So if you go to rock and roll songs and these protests, obviously, yeah, there's protests against the Vietnam War and U.S. Imperialism, but there's also, if you look at a lot of these songs, a lot of critiques of consumerism and the materialism of the communities in which they grew up. So if you think about Bob Dylan's song, you maybe heard about the times they are a-changing. Robert Zimmerman, if you hear that song, you might wonder, well, what does this really mean, the times they are changing? But if you read the lyrics carefully, what you can see is this revolutionary, generational revolution against the greatest generation that had grown up or that had sought the better life in places like Levittown. And their children who are singing these lyrics and going to these concerts and wearing bell bottoms and color patterns and talking about dropping out and tuning out and not to follow their parents and Brooks Brothers suits and going part of the corporate world, but being their own selves. This was in many ways a reaction to the stale conformity of the materialist suburb. So the times they are changing is in a sense a revolutionary call that this society that you created, mom and dad, I love you by the way, but this is not a healthy society. And our generation, we're going to get it right, and we're going to create a more spiritually fulfilling environment, a more just society where there's not this brutal beating of African American student activists like during the civil rights movement. We're going to build a society of social justice and equality. Now, there's many other songs we could turn to. The Beatles, "You Can't Buy Me Love." This is a very catchy song, very folksy. You could say, it's a good tune to dance to. But if you look at the lyrics, I mean, what is it essentially doing, right? You can't purchase happiness. That's the fundamental, assumption, the promise of the American dream. That if you have this salad shooter, if you got 2 cars in the driveway, you'll be happy. And what are the Beatles saying? You can't buy me love. Love is something else. So it's definitely not only that song, but rock and roll in general was offering a critique of the stale conformity of the automobile suburb. So when we look at what we call the counterculture movement, which has sometimes been described as a generational revolt, the baby boomers, as they were coming of age as teenagers, why did they become hippies and challenge the values of their parents in such a sharp, distinct, and clear way? We can see that the counterculture movement had, kind of different dimensions, right? And when we say counterculture movement, what we're talking about is how those various critiques of the American post-war society converged together in complicated ways. So the civil rights movement was largely led by African Americans against the racial discrimination. And one of the things that inspired the counterculture movement, in fact they copied some of the tactics, was these activists. And many of the baby boomers on television saw these episodes of just brutal violence, like on the Pettus Bridge, where beating African Americans, sending dogs on them, even in cases of the Freedom Riders, burning them in a bus. So the violence that was on display struck many people in white America, in the North particularly, were certainly prejudiced in many ways. It struck them as abhorrent, but particularly to the children, the young generation who saw this on TV, they were repulsed by it. And I think this repulsion that they saw on television in the 60s, early 60s, late 1950s, certainly stimulated their own rejection of the establishment, the man, and the Vietnam War. Now, of course, fighting Vietnam was a very powerful stimulus too, because especially by the late 1960s, when American boys were coming back in body bags, and when there was increasing revelations of the atrocities like My Lai that were committed in Vietnam. For many American teens, they didn't want to go to Vietnam. It just seemed horrible. So, what was the hippie slogan? Make love, not war. It was a clear rejection, not just of the Vietnam War, but the whole logic of the Cold War itself. The idea that somehow bombing or putting napalm on Vietnamese children was somehow defending freedom. It was a clear rejection of the United States imperial foreign policy. Or women. One of the things that was very evident to the flower children was that the society was very gendered, and that there were separate rules for men and women. So one big part of the counter culture movement was advocating for gender equality, including, of course, sexual equality. So the pill, for example, was seen as a liberating tool that would enable women to enjoy the pleasure of sexuality without the consequences of pregnancy that would have, an early pregnancy that would have put them at a disadvantage of the job market. The Vietnam War was obviously a very big factor in the counterculture movement. I think in the United States it served as, in a way, the amalgamator of these various critiques. People had various beefs with the society, its emptiness. Environmentalism was another part of it. Particularly, there was a lot of concern about public health and a lot of concern with corporations that polluted and made people very sick because of the lack of regulations. And in a way, when it came to various chemicals, for example, it was just a glorified unsupervised science experiment. Corporations were able to create whatever they was. There was no human testing. They just released these chemicals into the environment, and then we wonder why we have such high incidences of cancer. Well, you're putting carcinogens not only just in the objects that you're putting in your consumer home, but you're also even putting it into the food chain. So what do you expect? Now, to put the spotlight on one particular dynamic of this segregation in American society, which was certainly the dark side of the American dream. It was certainly something which Soviet Union in its Cold War propaganda made a lot of hay out of. That the United States said that they were the best society in the world, but look at how they treat African Americans. So the violence of white sheriffs in the South against African American activists, social justice activists, became essentially grist for the mill of Soviet propaganda. Now, to put a spotlight on this, I want you to find on YouTube a little video called Crisis in Levittown. It's a documentary from 1957. And what you can see is the type of overt racism that is clearly at play, and how this served to create the segregation of American cities in the post-war era. So if you look at this in particular, and you listen to some of the interviews of the white residents there, they will tell you in a very unapologetic, unvarnished way what they're feeling about an African American family, middle class, a veteran, respectable family person, but moving into their neighborhood. So this happened in Pennsylvania in 1957. It created an uproar, and in a way, it's coming at a critical moment during the civil rights movement to expose the powerful racism that was creating an unjust society. It was separate and very unequal, and by watching the documentary and listening to the people speak, it's a great window or text that will help you to understand how Americans were looking at race and how these racial attitudes manifested in terms of segregation inside cities. So I'm bringing this module to conclusion. I want you to kind of reflect on this history. To what extent was the automobile suburb that emerged from the Levittown model? Was this a society that was, horribly conformist, consumerist, and racist? Or would you say more charitably, no, this was the American dream for the GIs that bought these homes and settled there and raised their families? This was their aspiration for the good life. Maybe it's not our aspiration. Maybe in 21st century Canada, that's not what we want. Maybe we would say that their ideal was racist and consumeristic. But it was what Americans, especially white Americans, wanted in the immediate post-war era. Another thing which you could potentially reflect on as well is, what is your dream? Is the American dream still valid today? Or is it, housing so expensive that it seems like, completely out of reach of the average young people? So, most students are in Generation Z, and many of you are a lot more enthusiastic about cell phones than automobiles. Unlike your grandparents, you would never imagine opening up the hood and twiddling around with a carburetor or that sort of thing. What is your dream for the future? And is the American dream, a house in the suburbs, is that still something that you want? Is it something you want but you don't think you can attain? And what do you think is the best that you can hope for in your future? What will be the American dream in 20 years when you're my age, or I guess 30 years? Now, in thinking about the American dream, I had just one little tangent I wanted to bring in. And one of the interesting things is if you go to Our World in Data, where they gather data from all the world to enable you to compare regions and states, one of the things you see, which seems a little bit surprising at first glance, is the wealthier a country is, generally the unhappier it is. So in other words, if you think about an index like suicides or substance abuse or depression, generally the wealthier are, a place like the United States versus Guatemala, people in the United States are less happy, more depressed. So this is an interesting way to look at the American dream. I mean, we got these suburban homes. Many of you probably grew up in something resembling a suburban community. Of course, for many of you, you grew up in much more affluent neighborhoods, right? You wouldn't have been happy in a Levitt home to share your bedroom with 3 siblings. No, I mean, you maybe grew up in a McMansion, and maybe you had a Suburban, and your dad had a Corvette or whatever it is. So our dreams, in a way, our material well-being is much higher, but our discontentment is higher too. So how do you reconcile that contradiction? Does that show that the American dream is false? That we can't find happiness in goods, or as the Beatles would say, money can't buy me love? So the society might be very good at providing us with salad shooters, gadgets, and iPhones, but it's not something that's fulfilling, and it's isolating us. Maybe this rat race, and working so hard that we're no longer attached to communities, or neighbors, or family, and friends. So when you think about the American dream that you want, think about it. What is the version that you really, what is it that you really want? Not what the magazines and Madison Avenue tells you. What would really make you happy? Do you want to go up the corporate ladder and the rat race and work 70-hour weeks and be able to afford a $1 million home in the suburb with granite countertops, or is that going to lead you at the end of your life, at 70, be an alcoholic, depressed, and say, what the heck did I waste my life on?